Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekly reading report. It's time for my weekly reading report, where I talk about all the stuff that I read during the previous week, which in this case isn't all that much. Because last week, man, there was a lot going on last week. A lot. So I did read some stuff, but not as much as usual. And there were a lot of things that I wanted to read that I just was not able to get to. So that kind of sucks. But what did I read? Let's talk about that. So I will break out my list for the ever ongoing 500 book challenge. The challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy any new ones. So I only read one book, or I only completed one book for the challenge, and that was book number 234, and that was The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker. So let's talk about that book, which I have in this omnibus volume. This is Dracula and Other Horror Classics, which was published by Barnes & Noble as part of their classics line. And Bram Stoker gets the bad rap of only having written one good book and a lot of bad books. That's what you often hear about Bram Stoker. He wrote Dracula, which was good, but everything else he wrote sucked. Well, I can now tell you that he wrote at least 3 good books. He wrote Dracula, which was great. He wrote a collection of short stories, Dracula's Guest and Other Stories, which was also great. That is a collection of short horror stories you should certainly read if you're a horror fan. And he also wrote The Jewel of Seven Stars, which was a good book. It wasn't Dracula, it wasn't in that class, but it is a good book. But it's unusual in that there's a good version of this and a bad version of this. This was originally published in 1903, but it was also republished in 1912, or reprinted in 1912, and it was revised. And it was utterly destroyed by the revision. Basically, one chapter was removed, and the ending was completely changed, which changed the entire book, really, because I read the revised ending. This edition, fortunately, has the original version of the story, which is far superior. But I did read the revised ending online because I was curious, and it's terrible. It just completely destroys the whole point of the whole story, really. And I'm not sure why it was revised. It was either revised because the publishers wanted it changed, because the ending of this book is not just dark for a Victorian novel. It's like pitch black, the ending of this book. I was I was shocked, frankly, by the ending of this book. It was not what I expected, especially after Dracula. So you have this really dark ending, and that carries backwards for the whole story, because then what you have is just a really, really dark, pessimistic story if you are British at the time in Victorian England. It expresses all kinds of anxiety about the eventual end of the empire, the British Empire, and foreign evil, and all kinds of anxieties that Bram Stoker probably had. And it's just a really dark story. And so the revised edition that came out in 1912 gave it a happy ending, basically. It gave the story a happy ending, which makes it useless. It makes it just... It renders the story ridiculous, frankly, I think. So you have a good version of this and a bad version of this. Find the original version if you're going to read this story, the 1903 version, because it's really good. It is not what I expected. It has some clunky stuff in here. It has a ton of exposition. It has, it's very melodramatic in the way Dracula was, but perhaps even more so. It has a lot of moments in it which are just like, well, how did that happen kind of moments. It's like, well, how does that work? So it has moments like that. But overall, it's a good book, and the ending makes it fantastic. Basically, our main character in this is a lawyer. I wrote down the characters' names because otherwise I'll forget. Malcolm Ross, our narrator, is a lawyer, and he met a young woman named Margaret at a party, and he just fell head over heels for this woman. And he spent a little bit of time with this woman, but not much. But one time when he was out with her, he said, you know what, if you ever need me for anything, just call. And she does call because she needs him. She sends for him. And it turns out that her father, who is an Egyptologist, and his name, what was his name? Abel Trelawney. Abel Trelawney. So Abel Trelawney, the Egyptologist, has been injured and has been rendered unconscious, and he won't wake up. And so the police are called, and he is called, and he goes there, and it's a mystery what happened to her father. Now, he's an Egyptologist, and his house is full of ancient Egyptian relics, including mummies and other things. And there's a mummy of a cat, which is really creepy, that's just kind of hanging out there. And so his whole house is basically a museum. And he's unconscious and injured. And how did that happen? And that's a mystery. So it starts off as kind of a mystery story. There's going to be some minor spoilers here. But he does eventually wake up. And it turns out that years before, this guy Trelawney and a friend of his, they're both very interested in ancient Egypt and the relics of ancient Egypt. They discover a tomb. And it is the tomb of Queen Tara. Queen Tara. A queen whose very existence has been wiped from the historical record by the Egyptians. The Egyptians have tried to make it so no one would remember this queen. Now, this is a red flag right here. And it turns out she's not just a queen, but she's referred to as a sorceress. So she's a sorceress. And this tomb has been raided over time, but everybody who's tried to raid this tomb has been killed. But they find the tomb, they find the mummy of this queen, this sorceress. And basically, he finds the mummy, he brings the mummy back to England. And this queen, this sorceress, has laid out a whole plan for her resurrection. Her plan is that one day she will be resurrected so she could walk the earth again. Which seems pretty creepy because, she's a sorceress and something was shady about her because the Egyptians tried to wipe out the memory of her. And could this be because she was a female queen, which was highly unusual? It wasn't unheard of, but it was an unusual thing. But for some reason, she's been wiped from the historical record. So our Egyptologist decides, you know what? I believe all of this stuff. I believe she was a sorceress. And I want to have an experiment where we try to bring her back. We'll recreate here in England all of the conditions needed for her resurrection. And we will try to resurrect her. Let's do that. What's the worst that could happen? What's the worst that can happen? And our heroic barrister, he decides to join along with this because basically he's in love with Margaret. But he starts to have, as the day for this experiment comes closer, he starts to have second thoughts. He's Sorry for that interruption. I got a phone call. When I get phone calls, I have to take them, unfortunately. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yeah. Our barrister, Malcolm Ross, he's having second thoughts as the experiment comes closer to the time in which they have to do it. And he starts thinking, geez, what if this queen is evil? You know, he starts to think this. And, you know, is this a good idea? And one of the reasons he thinks this is because they've all come to believe, because of things that have happened in this story, that this queen is actually real and that her spirit is hovering around. And they have the mummy of this queen, and they think that the spirit is somewhere close to them. And it turns out the spirit seems to be influencing Margaret and occasionally kind of possessing Margaret and changing her personality. And Margaret all the time is very gung-ho for this experiment to happen. And she has nothing but positive thoughts about the queen. And she's like, the queen was wonderful. She was really ahead of her time. It'd be great if she comes back. But, you know, Malcolm Ross is like, is it really a good idea? And there's a chapter where he's thinking about all this and he's trying to resolve all the conflicting thoughts he has, because he's a Victorian guy. And so he believes in science. This is, a scientific age. But he's also religious. And so he's already trying to juggle these two ideas, which can be conflicting, science and his Christian religion. But human beings have this capacity to compartmentalize their beliefs and rationalize things. And so he's able to have both of these beliefs, a belief in science and the scientific method, and his religion. But now we have a magical queen, a sorceress from ancient Egypt. And if she is what she seems to be, then that means magic exists. And not only that, but the gods of ancient Egypt, they had to have to exist too. So how do we juggle all of these different things? All of these conflicting beliefs. And so we have a chapter where he's trying to figure all this stuff out, which is really interesting. And it is a chapter which was cut out of the revised edition. Now, eventually, of course, the experiment happens. And we have the Egyptologist, his friend that helped find the tomb. We have the doctor that was looking after the Egyptologist when he was unconscious and has kind of fallen under the Egyptologist's spell, and he becomes really interested in this whole thing. So he's there. Margaret's there, and Malcolm is there. And they unwrap the mummy of the queen, and her body is perfectly preserved. And then they have this experiment. And I won't tell you what happens because the whole book is leading up to this, but I will tell you it is a disaster. It's a disastrous thing that happened. And I was really surprised by the ending, particularly because I thought this was kind of going along the lines of Dracula, in that in Dracula, we have a foreign evil, an ancient evil coming to England, becoming a threat to the British way of life in Victorian England. And a small band of English people get together and defeat the evil. And I thought that was kind of how this was going to go. We have another ancient evil from a foreign land coming to Britain to threaten the British way of life. Basically, it seemed to be kind of the same setup. And we have a small band of British people. But it turns out, in this version of the story at least, they're not trying to fight the ancient evil. They're doing everything they can to make it happen because they believe, or they don't understand, that this queen, despite all the evidence, is actually an evil sorceress. They think, oh, everything will be fine. It'll be great for mankind if we can actually, resurrect somebody from the past. Think of the things we could learn. So they're actually helping the ancient evil along. And then we get this grim, horrible ending, which is completely the opposite of what happens in Dracula. This is kind of the anti-Dracula, where Dracula ultimately fails and is defeated by the British. In this one, that's not what happens. And it's really interesting and really dark. And despite the things in this book which are not so great, which I mentioned, overall, it's a pretty good book. And that ending is one of the major reasons why. The revised ending just kind of makes the whole story pointless in a way. It's just like, oh, here's a happy ending. I get it. If you were in Victorian England and you read this story and you get to the end of this book, you got to be like, what the hell? This is not what I expected. But that's exactly what makes it a good story. So I do recommend The Jewel of Seven Stars. Just read the first version, the version from 1903. Don't read that 1912 version. That one's crap. So there's that. I finished that book and I was really happy to read it. What else have I been reading? Well, I've been reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four. And unfortunately, I didn't read much of it this week, just because of the way things went. Hopefully, I'll be able to catch up. The last thing I read was pretty fantastic, though. I read issue 250 of the Fantastic Four, where the Fantastic Four and a bunch of guest stars have to battle against Gladiator, who basically has Superman's powers, it seems like. And it's great. Issue 250 is great. It starts with Spider-Man. So, it starts off awesome right away because we have John Byrne's Spider-Man. It's just a fantastic issue. I love that you have a little homage to the cover of the first Spider-Man story there, which is pretty cool. This story is full of cool stuff. We get Captain America in here. We get the X-Men, or what seem to be the X-Men. The Skrulls play a part in this story. And you got Captain America. Look at Captain America there fighting Colossus. This story, issue 250, it's awesome. There's the Thing and Johnny Storm. It's just great. It's a great story. It's beautifully drawn. It's fantastic. I was very happy to read that. So the next story in this omnibus is this one, which is issue 251. But that's not the next story I'm going to be reading from the Fantastic Four. Because actually the next story I have to read is this one. Let's get back to that. This is a what if story from the comic book What If. This is What If issue number 36. What if the Fantastic Four had not gained their superpowers? So I'm not sure why this issue of What If is not in the Fantastic Four John Byrne omnibus, because it is written and drawn by John Byrne. So, yeah, John Byrne, story and art. So why is this What If issue not in there? I don't know. But it is the next story I have to read. But since it's not in the omnibus, I have to read it electronically. So I will. And I'm hoping to get to that today. I haven't read any other comics this week just because of the way things have been going this past week. Haven't been able to read any of the Justice League Silver Age stuff that I've been reading. Nothing. But I have been reading another book. I started another book. And that's the one I talked about in my last video, which is this one. Robert E. Howard, The Life and Times of a Texas Author, written by Willard M. Oliver. I've read the first 6 chapters of this so far, and it's great. This is great. It's exactly what I thought it was going to be, which is a very well-researched biography where Willard M. Oliver takes all the information he could find, all the historical records, all the letters, everything, and all the previous biographies. He goes through all of that and writes this very detailed, informed biography of Robert E. Howard that's also very well written. It tells a really good story. It's really engrossing reading if you're interested in this writer, Robert E. Howard, and he is my favorite writer of all time. I've always been interested in him as a person. And so basically I've read about his childhood so far. And this is the most detailed record of his childhood that I've found outside of his own letters. So it's really, really interesting. And there's a bunch of information in here already that I didn't know. So that's always cool. So this is, exactly what I thought it would be. I'm hoping I could finish it this week so I could talk more about it next week. But yeah, it's great. Just know that. It's a great book so far. This is the biography I was hoping it would be. So Robert E. Howard, The Life and Times of a Texas Author. I'll tell you more about this once I finish it. And that was it. That was it. It was not a great reading week just because of, life. Real life, Roger. It sucks. I will catch you next time. Hopefully tomorrow. Hopefully for Roger's Random Book Show. We'll see how it goes. Okay, guys. I'll see you then.